G'day and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to divers to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, and people that have an intense passion for marine life. My name's Matt Testoni and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is Klaus Stiefel, and he is an author, underwater photographer, and marine biologist teaching marine biology in the Philippines. And today we're going to be talking all about gobies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries. So I know you're just finishing up a book about gobies. So tell me, first off, why did you write a book and why are you so interested in these amazing little fish?
So I was originally trained as a neurobiologist, as somebody studying brains. And then I had the pleasure of having 3 different research positions very close to the ocean. And that was in the US, in California, in Japan, in Okinawa, and in Sydney. And the thing which then started happening was that I was scuba diving more and more. And, as a trained biologist, I just, could not help myself but get more and more interested in fish. At one point, I decided I wanted to actually do a scientific study with fish. And then I essentially, mentally scanned the landscape. And then my intellectual eye fell on the gobies. And so what are gobies? They're small, both marine, brackish, and freshwater fishes. They're typically elongate, cigar-shaped. They're often very small, and very often they either sit on the sand or they would sit on corals. Now, the thing is, there is an incredible amount of gobies. So this is something you notice whenever you go on a dive. So if once you have noticed, there's a goby over there, you can't help it other than to find gobies, wherever you look. And that kind of struck me originally, this enormous biodiversity. So if you go to FishBase, which is an online database of all fish known to science, right now what's listed are 1,850 gobies. Now to compare, I think about 4,500 mammals are known to science. So they're just a little bit less than half as many gobies as there are mammals. And I think this is amazing. So this enormous diversity of gobies, struck me right away. And then I adopted the gobies as my main interest when it comes to fish biology.
Cool. So gobies are they're usually kind of less than 10 centimeters, but they do get a lot bigger. They sit on the seafloor, and I know they have a pretty peculiar way of sitting because they have a fused kind of pelvic fin that kind of lets them kind of prop up and stay on the seafloor. But what do gobies eat, and where exactly do they spend most of their time?
So, this is a question which we would have to do, about 16 additional podcasts to answer that comprehensively. So in the 1,850 species of gobies, there are massive differences. So for instance, have you ever photographed a bearded goby when you were in the tropics?
No.
These are the ones in between the coral. Yeah, but you know about these?
I actually was just looking them up, and I was going to ask you why they have beards or so much facial kind of hair, as you would say.
I don't think anybody knows, but what the reason I brought them up is that so they live in between hard corals. At night, of course, the corals put out the polyps, and then the gobies eat the hosts. So these gobies are essentially coral parasites. So they eat their tiny little houses. You have a lot of other gobies which feed on plankton, which feed on filamentous algae. They would feed on tiny crustaceans, potentially fish larvae. So there's, of course, a size cutoff on what they feed, but there is a huge variety of food sources. Now, it's even, if you look at a food web, just to explain for your viewers, right, you have this connection in every ecosystem, that you have a shark which feeds on, let's say, groupers. The groupers would feed on wrasses. and that maybe on parrotfish. The parrotfish would feed on algae. So there is this system, with different species feeding on different things. The gobies are very much at the bottom of this food web, and they are capable of feeding on this millimeter-sized crustaceans, basically. So they provide a link between these, filamentous algae and tiny crustaceans to the larger animals in their food web. So they essentially get the biomass up from the primary producers, from the algae and from the shrimp up to the mid-sized fish. So by eating these abundant food sources, they bring them into the marine ecosystems.
Yeah, and just to go back to what they eat a bit, they, saying that the bearded goby lives in the coral and kind of eats the coral polyps, and then they're also eating all these tiny shrimp, and then I also know some gobies even eat parasites, like kind of clean parasites off other animals. So they kind of, exist in a huge part of the food web, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting what you mentioned with the parasites. So if you dive in the Great Barrier Reef, you will see these cleaner wrasses, which obviously are wrasses, and they are specialized on picking parasites of bigger fish. Now, the Caribbean doesn't have cleaner wrasses. And the ecological role of the niche of the cleaner wrasses is taken by gobies. And interestingly, they have the same coloration. So a juvenile cleaner wrasse has black and blue stripes, and these cleaning gobies look the same.
Do you think that's because the gobies have kind of mimicked these other cleaner fish and then outcompeted them, or that the fish that get cleaned kind of recognize the cleaner fish from other parts of the world, and so that's why the gobies have changed their color?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think this, blue and black stripes, they are very strong signal for the fish visual system. So, this kind of coloration is very easy to see for other fish. And hence, this is, a very good coloration for a cleaner fish. So it is probably evolved independently twice.
Wow. And so we mentioned the bearded goby, which lives in the coral. What other kind of cool homes do they have? Because I know there's a few more really cool ones.
Yeah. So, my main passion, among the gobies, and actually my research interest are the shrimp gobies. So you have about 120 species of gobies, which share a burrow with a small shrimp. And now why would they do that? So they live in the sandy plains, in this otherwise really inhospitable areas where they would have no place to hide from predators. The shrimp would dig that burrow. And if you look at these burrows, they're very cleverly constructed. So they're almost arches, like on a Romantic church, they're on the entrance. So the shrimp use different pieces of coral rubber to create a proper entrance arch. Now, the problem the shrimp has, it's not completely blind, but it has very poor eyesight. And the goby, as a consequence, helps the shrimp out. So what the goby does, it's motionlessly perches at the entrance. And if there is a predatory fish approaching, it would either just, briefly flick its tail if the predator is still a while away, or it would just escape into the burrow. And obviously the shrimp notices both. So the shrimp essentially has a guard with a communication system to let it know if a dangerous predatory fish approaches. It's a trade-off, a burrow digging versus guard duties. And this is fascinating to watch. So this starts, if you're in Australia on the East Coast, it starts a little bit north of Sydney. So if you're in northern New South Wales, you can observe species of gobies like that already. And obviously, if you're in Queensland and on the Great Barrier Reef, there's ample of that. Any patch of sand next to a block of coral would have shrimp gobies. So the shrimp gobies, their movements around their burrow, this is the topic of the research project, which I'm presently writing up.
Wow. Because I always kind of think of it as the shrimp is kind of like the maid in a way, kind of like cleans house and, make sure the burrow is nice and tidy and open. And then, the goby is, kind of just sits outside. And I didn't know it had such a cool communication system, but it is an amazing sight to see a really colorful shrimp and a really colorful goby kind of just hanging out together. It's crazy.
It's fascinating. And, in the 70s, these researchers in the Red Sea would fill these burrows with acrylic, and then they would dig them up so they could see the shape of these burrows. These are sophisticated burrows that, sometimes they branched and they are chambers for the shrimp's eggs. And what the shrimp also do, the burrow might start on sand, but then they will very quickly tunnel towards a spot where there is a coral bommy or a rock, and they would use that as a ceiling. So, they're very clever, the shrimp. And then they dig the burrow, they maintain it. At night, they close it. So the shrimp and the goby hide underground, and then the shrimp would collapse the entrance. A short while after sunset, would they come back out? It's quite an intricate symbiosis, really.
Yeah. And so do you find, do pairs of gobies live with a shrimp? Like if the gobies are breeding, or is it kind of just a visit and then are there eggs involved in the burrow? Or
Yeah, it's very interesting. So what you usually, when you observe this, if you want to observe this as a diver, you really have to be very good with your buoyancy and, don't flail around and, breathe very calmly and, make sure you don't get too close. And then, you can observe this behavior when you're underwater. Now, when you observe that, you will typically see one shrimp coming out. In reality, there are two in the burrow, which would alternate. So, one shrimp would push out sand and rubber while the second shrimp is still underground. And then they alternate. Now, they are typically a mated pair. They would spend most of their lives in that one burrow. The gobies, yes, you see couples, you see pairs in one burrow. Very often, and I actually have footage of what I believe is a mating dance, where they very quickly beat their pectoral fins. And so I believe what's mostly happening is that the goby would mate with a goby from a neighboring burrow. Now, very often these burrows they're 2 or 3 per square meter. This is a very successful symbiosis. So it's not very far to find the next goby. So this is typically how they would mate. I believe they would then typically stick their eggs to a solid surface near the entrance. In almost every goby species, shrimp goby or other goby, it's the male fish which guards the eggs.
Wow, it's such a cool partnership. I love some of the ocean animals really do split the gender roles. I guess because the female goes to all this effort of making the eggs and laying them, and the male's kind of like, well, I guess I'll kind of, watch out for them. But that's kind of fascinating.
Correct. Yeah. It's like a split of effort. Yeah. It's obviously like a big effort in terms of investing biomass to make all these eggs. You also see that in the cardinal fish, for instance, of course, where the male takes the fertilized eggs in its mouth. Same thing, right? The effort is split halfway.
Yeah. It's just, it's really cool to see. I know with weedy sea dragons, where the male carries eggs on his tail, that's one of the biggest things people comment on is the equal split in gender responsibility.
Yeah, very interesting. So of course, all other pipefish and seahorses do that too. Interestingly, like in ghost pipefish, it's not the case. So the female breeds the fertilized eggs as well. If you look at pairs of ghost pipefish, you will very often see that the female is much bigger than the male for that purpose, right? So she is doing all the job other than the fertilization. They're often, more than twice the size of the males for that reason.
Yeah, and I guess that's interesting that there's always kind of an exception to the rule. And that's one thing I was reading at Gobies as well. There really isn't a set goby fact because they are just so varied.
Exactly. And, huge amount of specialization. So, another thing is I just last weekend, I went to look for gobies in the mountains on the island where I'm living, which is Negros, which is in the central Philippines. And so you find these gobies, at 400 meters sea level, you find these small mountain creeks full of gobies. Now, how do they reproduce? It's super interesting. The male builds a nest, protects the nest. The eggs would then hatch. The larva would be swept into the ocean. There, the larva would grow to adult size, which, might take 2 or 3 weeks. Once the larva settles as an adult fish, it would swim upstream and sometimes, 6, 7, 8 kilometers to a piece of mountain creek. So, completely different type of reproduction than what you find in the ocean. All of the species have their peculiarities.
Yeah. And so just on those ones you mentioned, I presume these rivers are freshwater where they're actually making their little burrows and then they get swept into the salt and they come back to the fresh?
Correct, yeah.
Wow.
So you cannot breed them in an aquarium because once, the eggs would hatch, and then the larva would start swimming around in your freshwater aquarium, it would never turn into an adult goby because just the salt water is missing. Being in the ocean for 2 weeks is a stimulus they need to become adults.
So their reproduction is that they once the larvae come out, they wait until they get to the salt water to kind of grow up.
Yes, they do. And I mean, this has a number of advantages, of course, right? I mean, the larva will be able to feed in a very different habitat than the adult. So there will be two very different types of food sources for, the two different life stages. The other thing is we're talking about really tiny mountain creeks. And, it sometimes doesn't take much for that mountain creek to dry out. Now, what's going to happen then, right? The larva will just find itself another river. So, this is a very good way of settling different freshwater rivers via the ocean. And fascinating stuff. Have you visited Hawaii?
No.
You should go sometime. It's lovely. In terms of destinations, everything is far from Australia. I understand that, but it's not actually that far. It's relatively easy to reach. Now, Hawaii, pretty much the only freshwater fish on Hawaii because of its remoteness are gobies, which do exactly that. They live as larvae. There are a few exceptions, but mostly they're gobies there in the freshwater. Now, what Hawaii is famous for are these amazing waterfalls. So these waterfalls, which sometimes are, almost 100 meters in altitude, there are actually gobies which climb up. So you mentioned the fused pelvic fin of the gobies. So they use that like a suction device. And then they inch their way up these waterfalls. So then, you have these freshwater rivers and they are separated by a, 40, 50-meter waterfall from the ocean. And you still have gobies in there, which spent the first 2 weeks of their lives in the ocean.
Wow.
So, amazing biology of gobies. Yeah.
That's insane. I guess that's why they have been able to colonize pretty much the entire world is because they, one moment they're living with a shrimp and then a little bit of evolution and they're able to climb a waterfall. That is mind-blowing.
Yeah. No, I agree. And there is such this diversity of different gobies. Mind-blowing is exactly the word. You have invasive species, your gobies, which are invasive species. The Great Lakes in North America, there's this round goby, which has completely taken over some of these habitats. So, I think they got there from Europe, and they're now spreading while they're not native to the region. So, that's the thing with goby biology. They look very inconspicuous, like just a tiny fish which tries to get away from you as a diver. And then, you have to swim really carefully and approach and develop a really good eye. But then in reality, once let's say you photograph that fish, then you're back on land, you look it up, and then you learn a little bit about it. A lot of these species just show incredible life history strategies.
Yeah. And so tell us, what's your favorite goby?
My very favorite goby is probably Randall's shrimp goby. So there are two reasons for that. I believe you've probably seen that one. So it's a white shrimp goby with orange bars and a very large dorsal fin with kind of a dot on that fin. You find that on drop-offs. Often you have these little sandy balconies on these drop-offs. They're typically deeper than 20 meters. They're really pretty gobies. And the species is named after John, Jake Randall, who was one of the pioneers of fish biology. So he was based in Hawaii, and he was, starting in the late 40s, early 50s. He was one of the first scientists who used scuba to research fish. So, I both like the goby and I like the fact that it's named after, Jake Randall. Randall just passed away, I believe, last year at age 92, 93, like in his 90s.
Wow.
So, I think it's awesome that there's a goby to honor this great scientist.
Yeah. Yeah. So I presume the goby was like found and named after him, or did he find the goby?
I think it was named after him. I think it's considered bad style if you name a species after yourself. I think it's still like that. So you can either name it after a location, or you can name it after somebody whom you admire. But it's considered pretty narcissistic if you find a species and then give it your last name. That's not being done.
Yeah. Well, I was just discussing. The reason I ask is I was just discussing this the other day. Like, is there a point, like in history, where people stopped naming stuff after themselves, or was it always that way that they didn't do it?
I think in science, I'm not sure actually. So obviously there's this system for naming animals with a genus and a species name. Goes back to Carl von Linné, the Swedish taxonomists, and I think that he was active in the late 1700s.
Yeah.
1780s. That's something like that. And I don't think a lot of species were named after the discoverer. I think sometimes there's false modesty in science, but at least there's some kind of modesty. I think sometimes there's enough. Scientists would still have egos, of course, but I think in many instances you're at least supposed to pretend that you are a modest person.
Yeah. Well, I guess there goes
Yeah.
my chance to name Matt's goby. So.
Well, you have to become famous and have a number of students, and they will find one, and I'm sure they will name one after you.
So, if anyone wants to see gobies, let's go back on the goby track. Like, what's kind of some of the best places in the world, and what are your tips for finding gobies in the wild?
Yeah, so I assume most of your listeners will be based in Australia and based on the shore. Now, I've done a lot of dives in the Sydney region. I've done only a few dives in Port Phillip Bay, but the thing is, gobies are everywhere. And really the key, there's this natural progression of your naturalist eye as a diver. So, I see your background. There's this amazing marble ray. Is that a marble ray? I believe so, right?
Smooth ray.
And that's, of course, as a smooth ray. Yeah? So that's, of course, a massive animal. And then if you see that, everybody will be amazed. And, somebody with 3 dives on your very first dive, you will notice this. Now, the more you dive, just try to teach your eye, go slow. Well, there's a sponge. Is there something moving behind that sponge? What's that? And then really a common beginner's mistake, I'm sure you've seen that yourself a lot too, is that people are trying to be, underwater Michael Phelps. And you don't need to swim very fast. That's not the point of scuba diving, is it? So you want to swim slowly. And you really want to take your time to observe. And that, why there is really, if you're with a dive buddy and not with a group, there's an interesting looking rock with some activity. Stay on that rock for 15 minutes. And then once you settle down, once you're not flailing anymore, once your breathing has calmed down, once you've stopped kicking, you should, of course, have neutral buoyancy. And then, if you're calm, the marine life will calm down. And then, this will make it easier to observe bigger fish as well, right? The wrestlers will be doing their rest things. They will start feeding, they will not be afraid of you. But especially these tiny, tiny fish, to which the gobies belong, they will be, coming out of the crevices. They will be, moving around the corals or the rocks. they will start feeding. Maybe you will see two gobies in a confrontation. So, if you go slow, if you take it easy, try to make the marine life comfortable, you will start noticing the small things. And then it doesn't even really matter that much where you are. There are definitely very interesting gobies in Sydney. And there's Huses goby, I think, in English. And then that's probably the most common species. But, if you look in little crevices, unfortunately, there's once in a while you see beer bottles underwater. Look into these, what's there. Or, maybe there is a shell of a dead mollusk, look below that. Maybe there's a goby there. So if you just take your time, you pretty much on every dive site, you will see gobies.
Yeah, and I think it's such a cool sea creature to go find because, often if you talk about like, big manta rays or something, there's specific places you're going. But because gobies are literally everywhere, it's just you go and find them at your local dive site.
I agree. And, I have to say, unfortunately, as you know and agree, many parts of the ocean these days are stressed, right? So sometimes you have sites which are too close to human habitation. There's runoff and, that in the tropics that would often kill the corals. But then what's very hard to kill are the gobies. So I've been to dive sites which have, it's kind of a dubious distinction. So there's dive sites where there was just, runoff from a fish farm. And, all the corals had died 15 years ago. And then and there was one such site where we found a goby, which was a new description for the Philippines. So previously that species had only been known from Papua New Guinea. And now we were the first ones to describe it in the country. And this was a site, it wasn't toxic material, there were no heavy metals or anything, but there was just too much fish poop from adjacent fish farms. And so a lot of the marine life had really, ceased to exist, but the gobies were still there.
Well, I think what I got out of that is that gobies are going to inherit the world when everything goes belly up.
Yes, likely, and I hope so. It might be a better world if gobies are ruling it, not humans.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show. And if anyone wants to see any of your books or see any of your photos or any of your research, what should they do and where should they go?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a book about gobies. It's called The Lives of Gobies. I'm still looking for a publisher for this book. So if you are a publisher or a literary agent, or if you know one, please get in touch with me. All my audiovisual material is on social media under the name Pacific Klaus. So, Pacific, like the Pacific Ocean, and Klaus, like my first name, with a K, not with a C, one word. So I'm on Flickr, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And I also have a blog, which is pacificklaus.com. So particularly the YouTube and the Flickr pages have a lot of goby material, freshwater gobies, there are marine gobies, shrimp gobies, there are photographs, videos. So yeah, please visit, please enjoy.
Awesome. Well, I am excited for that book. And I am going to try right now after this podcast and get a copy before it's actually published. But thank you again for being on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast. First, I just want to thank all the Patreon supporters that we have so far. So thanks, Callie, Natalia, Warren, Annalise, Madeline, Thomas, Samantha, and Josie. If you'd like the show and want to support more episodes, jump on board at patreon.com/Seacreatures and become one of our Patreons. Also, don't forget that you can get your own copy of Klaus's book, All About Gobies, by visiting one of the links or by keeping an eye on the Seacreatures Podcast Instagram, where I'll post a link to the book. It's pretty good. Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. Music by Dan Musil and his amazing slide guitar, and assistant production by George McGrath. You can see some of my photography on Matt_Testoni_photography on Instagram and Facebook, or by visiting mtunderwatermedia.com. Coming up next time on the Seacreatures Podcast, we're going to be talking to Dr. Jody Rummer all about epaulet sharks, which are a lot scarier than they sound, but are pretty cool and crazy animals. So keep your eye out for that episode. This has been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.